So, Stephen Dubberly's here, head of the UNT Opera Department. Hello.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Working? Good. And also Keith Cerny, CEO of the Dallas Opera. We had a lot of fun last time talking about Aida, which was, as I understand it, the opera that caused Puccini to get serious about opera. Do you know anything about that?
That's what I understand as well. When he was young, he had been a very precocious composer and interested in vocal music, or interested in church music as well. But it was seeing a production of Aida that just lit a fire under him. He was not able, as a child, he didn't grow up in a big city, but when he saw Aida, he said, that's it. What you have to realize about Puccini is that he is more than or less than a composer, however you want to look at it. When I was in school, it was very fashionable to look down on Puccini. But what Puccini is, and I think what nobody would argue, regardless of what they think of the quality of his music, and I happen to love it, is that he was a man of the theater. And it was that discovery that music and theater can go together in a special way that was to completely change the course of his life and enrich ours.
Well, Keith Cerny, it does seem that Puccini is always successful in theater, except for Edgar, right? But I don't know. Somebody may pull it off.
I doubt it.
Okay.
Actually, speaking of Edgar, back when I was a music student and freelancer in London, I was the assistant conductor of a double bill with Puccini's Edgar and Le Villi. And this was back in 1984, before even the Met had done it. And we did both productions. They're very early Puccini, but they have some worthwhile moments. And that's also, by coincidence, where I met my wife, so it had a happy ending too.
Awesome. And she was not Tigrana.
She was singing in the chorus.
Well, Turandot, the Dallas Opera, has done this before. And tell us about the programming of this. When did it come about, and when did you know you had a cast?
Well, the programming of this, of course, was set several years ago, in fact, even before I came to Dallas. And as we reoriented our season, we wound up with this season we have this year, where we open, of course, with Aida and then perform Turandot and Aspirin Papers in the spring. It's an interesting pairing. Originally, 3-4 years ago, the plan would have been, in fact, to do 4 or 5 operas. We wound up with the 3 for this year. And I think Aida and Turandot sit very well, 2 very famous operas by 2 extraordinarily famous composers. And in fact, in my mind, they're both, if you will, top 10 operas. Turandot is sometimes, if you read opera base, I think they call it a top 15. But the reason for that is because small companies can't really pull it off, and so it skews the numbers. If you look at big companies like Dallas on up, in fact, it's definitely a top 10 opera.
And the top 1 for aria.
And certainly it's one of the most famous arias, and that links to all the sort of the mythology of famous tenors, and there's a lot to work with.
So when did you guys know that you had Lisa Lindstrom? Do you know when that was?
That would have been at least 2.5 years ago, probably 3 years ago.
So she may have already done the Met. For those who don't know, her first Met appearance was as Turandot in their production. So
2009.
2009. So I'm curious if you got her before she was at the Met.
You know, I don't know. Just knowing how it works with artists of her caliber, my guess is we probably had her signed before the Met appearance, but I don't know, since that was before I got here.
Well, it's quite a deal. Now, you mentioned to me that you have a personal connection with Lisa Lindstrom's family as well.
Well, just by coincidence, I happen to know her father very well, and John, who's a delightful man and is involved in various opera nonprofits. He's on the board of the San Francisco Opera Merola program. And I know him from a social organization I belong to. And I can tell you there is no one prouder on this earth than Sean of his daughter and how well she's done. And it's, as he should be. It's delightful. He travels with his wife all over the world and has heard Lisa sing. And as far as I know, he's still planning to come here to Dallas this spring to hear her sing again.
Now, as the unknown prince, you have Antonello Palumbi, and we talked about him in the last talk we had because he's also going to be in Aida. So that's really a little unusual for you to have the same tenor in 2 major roles in a season, right?
It is relatively unusual, but I think it fits well with the fact that these works, although set in different kinds of mythologies, both have that mythological component. We talked last time about how Aida is rooted in history, which it is, but nonetheless it still has that, to some extent, a mythical feel. And just by the vagaries and good fortune of scheduling, Puccini was available for both works, which is why he was cast for both.
Okay. Well, I do want to get into these characters here. For people who are not familiar with the work, we'll talk about who they are, and Stephen Dubberly, I'm sure, will give us a fantastic synopsis in just a moment. I do want to go back to this thing of Puccini. Is he underappreciated by scholars still, and overappreciated by audiences somehow? And why is there that disconnect? Is it a simple popularity matter, or what?
Well, probably we both have a point of view on that.
Yeah.
My view is that Puccini's craft is extraordinary. And in fact, speaking as someone who's both a musician and a business person, I've worked with many musicians over the years, and I think all of us feel that when we have to revive a poem or some of the Puccini classics, that we're struck by how tightly it's put together, how carefully it's orchestrated. It's really quality work. So from that point of view, it's something that I think both audiences love and open-minded music professionals love as well. I will say I was at University of California in Berkeley in the late 70s and early 80s when Professor Joseph Kerman was still very much active. He's emeritus now, he's in his late 80s. And still they were talking about his book, Opera as Drama, where he refers to Tosca as the shabby little shocker. And I know what he means and the point he was trying to make, but I also think there's a lot of real craft in Puccini, which is one of the reasons why lots of composers of all ages and nationalities try to emulate his compositional style, and really very few pull it off, in my opinion.
Now, Stephen Dubberly, if you don't mind, let's and your opinions on that as well, if you don't mind first.
Yeah, I think, and Joseph Kerman was a great scholar in many ways, but I think Puccini has been much misunderstood both ways. I think because he was such a serious craftsman, and as we've said, we miss sometimes the fact that it's just glorious music, but at the same time, he was so concerned. He was a great man of the theater and quite intellectual and quite forward-thinking, but he was also, at the same time, and there's nothing wrong with this, really obsessed with what would sell and what people would like, to the point that at certain points in his career, and Turandot is not one of them, at certain points in his career, he was even felt shackled by the expectations. Once you've had a few hits, how do you keep doing a few hits? And so he got to the place where people were expecting him to be the same old Puccini, even when he didn't want to. And then you have to understand the extraordinary time in which he lived, especially thinking about Turandot, thinking about the later operas. Puccini began working before Debussy did. And he was influenced by Debussy. He saw Stravinsky and Schoenberg and was very much interested in what they were doing. This was a time of tremendous upheaval, culturally as well as socially, politically. And there are a few quotes where he talks about, not liking modern music because it's ugly. But for the most part, he was fascinated by modern music. And I think that some people, Schoenberg in particular, held it against Puccini that he could remain so popular, and they saw him as a sellout, and they failed to see some of the more radical elements in his work. And this is what's so wonderful about Turandot, is that it works as drama, although a completely different kind of theater from the veristic, literal theater that he'd done before, the realistic. But at the same time, it's very modern in many ways. And I look forward to talking about that, because I think it shows that he's misunderstood. But if I could just say one more thing, he's also misunderstood the other way. The thing is, every time you trot out Bohème and trot out Tosca, trot out Madame Butterfly, I mean, every time I go back to these pieces and I feel like I know them like the back of my hand, I'm amazed at how perfect they are and how radical they are, how modern they are. But you'll ask person on the street, what do you love about Puccini? Oh, I love the soaring vocal melodies. What's so interesting is that when you get to know Butterfly really well, there aren't that many soaring vocal melodies. It really is ingenious writing that's very much in the Wagnerian mold of recitative. And most of the soaring melodies are actually in the orchestra, not with the singers. But he did it so well and so artfully that we come away thinking that is stunningly beautiful, and it is. But that doesn't mean it's not great.
Kurt, if I may, this is just
Sure.
this is an area that I'm also very passionate about. I have worked with 10 different opera companies, either as a consultant or a line executive, and a lot of boards at those different companies. And over the years, people have seriously proposed, in some instances, that the particular opera company at the question produce a season that is all Puccini or mostly Puccini. And naturally, the general director always wants to incorporate more diversity, but there's this idea out there that a season of all Puccini would be this huge commercial success. What's interesting to me about this is that even Puccini is not Puccini, in the sense that what people mean is that handful, that troika of blockbusters. But in fact, I've done as a thought experiment, I'm not going to do this seriously, putting a whole season of Puccini together of 5 operas. And in fact, if one wanted to do it, and it would be more appropriate for a festival in Italy than an American opera company, you could, as Kurt mentioned, you have these very interesting works at Garden Villi, which you can see the roots of the genius really starting to take hold. You have the classic, most popular operas, but then you have these other interesting works with their influences of Debussy, different kinds of chromaticism and tonal colors. And certainly at San Francisco Opera, I mean, Manon Lescaut and Rondinette are not huge sellers. They're beautiful works, but they're not the big sellers. And then, of course, you have other operas as well that you could draw from on this. So the point, I think, is that Puccini in this odd way has been typecast as this very particular soaring kind of melody, when in fact I think your point, Stephen, is great. If you take a work like Bohème, the first act, yes, there's some wonderful arias, but there's a lot of moments where it's just a beautiful sung line that just advances the story, and we take it from there. But this topic, sometimes people say, well, we need a whole season of Verdi, but Verdi, because he wrote so many and they're so different and some of them are not so accessible, that never seems to take hold in people's mind, is this notion that we might consider a season of only Puccini.
Well, when you look at the amount of pieces he wrote, it's not like Rossini, dropping the score paper off his bed and saying, "Oh, never mind, I can start over again." He seemed to work very deliberately, maybe like a Ravel or somebody like that. Not only that, but his personality. I'd like to get a little into what we know about his personality, because it seems like he really tasked his librettists with a lot of back and forth and a lot of deliberation about how a scene should go.
I love that. I'd never thought of the comparison to Ravel. I think of it more as, and I like that, because they were both very detailed craftsmen. Ravel, however, prided himself on being able to write any kind of music for any kind of occasion. Puccini, actually, it was more painful for him to write than it was for Ravel. I see it as an extension of Verdi. As we talked about with Aida, Verdi begins incredibly prolifically and really writing formula operas. But as he becomes more and more aware of this amazing marriage of music and theater, he starts writing more slowly. And as you say, and as we talked about last time, terrible problems with librettists that would never be solved for Verdi until he encountered Boito, who is in many ways the man who was his alter ego. And then he writes those last 2 great masterpieces, and at that point he's writing in a completely different style from where he started. And we talked last time that Aida really is the beginning of that. With Puccini, it's the same way. He has great success, and he's writing Verismo at a time when Verismo is very popular. But as he's himself modernizing, he has more and more trouble finding the right words. The reason he never finished Turandot is that he wasn't happy with that last scene. But even before that, we see, as you say, he was so brutal. But, you know, Verdi was brutal too with his librettist, but Puccini, there's no comparison. He was downright rude. I mean, and I think if it weren't for the fact that Verdi was such a success, Puccini would not have had the luxury of berating his librettist the way he did. But he
was a precedent.
He found a good team idea where he would work, for example, in the early operas with Giacomo and Illica. Illica would write the story and really detail the story, and Giacomo would set it to verse, make poetry out of it. And it was a wonderful working relationship while it lasted, and he was finding that in Turandot as well. But finding the right people, finding the right words. As I said, this was a man who voraciously attended the theater. We know that he got the idea for Madame Butterfly when he actually saw the play, the Belasco play in London. But he was very interested even in new works like Pirandello, people like that. And it's interesting to talk about the use of masks in Turandot and how that reflects this early 20th century anti-romantic idea of masks and of mechanism, which people talk about Turandot, and detachment, exactly. Like Stravinsky, in a way neoclassical, the opposite of the kind of pieces he was writing before. But he was so crippled, I guess, by this combination of factors, not happy with Libretti, wanting to be on the cutting edge dramatically, needing to please an old-fashioned crowd musically, and it really became very, very difficult for him. The other problem he had, quite frankly, was he was sleeping with just about every woman in the world except his wife. And he also was a control freak, and this is another part of it. He went to Buenos Aires, he went all over Europe, supervising productions of his compositions because he wanted it done a certain way. And we're very fortunate to have written records, particularly by a gentleman named Ricci, who was a pianist and coach for many of his productions, of how Puccini would spend time screaming at conductors for taking the music too slow, even though we still do that today. It is a pet peeve of mine. But he really wanted to make sure that the productions were true to what his intent was. And because of that, all that took away from the facility of composition, but certainly it got harder and harder for him to do that as he went along.
When it comes to conductors, I understand he made a relationship with Toscanini that seemed to work, that came into this production as well.
Absolutely. And again, I love tying this to Aida because Verdi got very, very upset after the premiere of Aida because there's this wonderful rant that Verdi wrote about conductors and how conductors feel that they have to add their own personality into a particular production, so they decide to make everything slow and soft here when it's written loud and fast. And Verdi would say, just do it the way I want it. Toscanini represents a completely new kind of conductor. He really was the pioneer of the new conductor of the 20th century who said, we are here to serve the composer. And that reverence toward what the composer wrote, Toscanini was derided in his day for insisting on the letter of what a composer wrote. You can't change the dynamics in Beethoven, you can't change the tempos in Beethoven. And it was that reverence for performing a work as the composer intended that made him an ideal interpreter of Puccini. Because Puccini, like Ravel, you really have to realize that what's happening with musical notation as you move along is that they're getting more and more specific. And they're struggling with ways, if you've ever tried composing, you have an idea in your head. When you put it on paper, is it going to sound the way I want it in my head? And so you're struggling with being more and more detailed as there are more and more techniques. And so all of these things come together to make it a difficult but wonderful thing for Puccini.
Let's go back to the story a bit. It was a very different subject matter, it would seem, although it's in Asia, as Madame Butterfly was. There's a Japan opera, and so, hey, let's do a China opera. But this book that he seems to have gotten it out of just seems really enchanting. It seems like one of those old dusty things you'd find in a basement somewhere. Absolutely.
I just want to interrupt ourselves for just a second, because Keith, you were about to
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
Say something
that's
about
fine.
that.
No,
Sorry.
let's move to the,
Okay.
to the story.
Okay.
That's fine.
Yes, it is completely different. Let's talk a little bit about.
And it sounds like something maybe Rimsky-Korsakov would have picked,
Yeah.
for a fairy tale opera or something like that.
It's interesting because there were really two Italian dramatists. We're back in the 18th century now, the 1700s. Two of the leading playwrights in Italy were, of course, the great Carlo Goldoni, who single-handedly invented comic opera. We would not have the great Mozart da Ponte operas, Marriage of Figaro and Così fan tutte and Don Giovanni, without the influence of Goldoni. And Goldoni loved writing situational comedies that were still very interested in character and character development and drawing on the old traditions of the improvised Italian comedy. And then there was this other man who wasn't nearly as successful in his time, Carlo Gozzi. And Gozzi was a completely different kind of playwright, and he would end up having more of an influence, as you say, outside of Italy, very much in Eastern Europe. We would never have the magic flute without the 18th century influence of Gozzi, who loved not the traditional stock characters of the improvised comedy, but fable and myth. And so his plays are full of archetypal characters, they're full of ritual, they're full of even stories that seem to work not on their own steam, and particularly not in a comic way, but tend to slow everything down and present everything as sacred. And that, if you think about it, that's what Magic Flute is. And it was that theatrical impetus that was to have such an effect on composers like Rimsky-Korsakov and Eastern European composers. And so it's really a completely different way of looking at theater. It's more pageantry, and again, it's very much rooted in myth and in symbolism.
Well, but it didn't only. I'm sorry.
Well, I wanted to say, in addition to that, I think one of the unique features of myth and particular stories, but to some extent theater based on myth, is that in that kind of literature, it's very possible for someone to have a flash transformation. So in the real world, if we've known somebody for 20 years and we see them, not having seen them for a few months, most of the time we expect them to be much the person they were. They might be a little older, maybe they'd been had some big event in their life, but there's that real sense of continuity. Whereas myths are full of people, seeing a magic mirror, seeing a reflection of something, kissing a prince, whatever it may be, where there's that instantaneous transition from one persona to another. Sometimes that's a physical transformation, they become something else, sometimes their mental transformation happens. But I think one of the challenges in Turandot, and why Puccini struggled with it so much, was that's very tough to pull off on stage. When we see on stage, we want to have seen some. If someone's going to make a big transition in who they are, we want to have seen
an emotional
precursors
motivation
of that, or some clue that this is going to happen earlier on. And in fact, if you read reviews of new plays, that's one of the things critics love to complain about, is there were the character that why they did something wasn't well enough established early on. And I think that's another component, because the fables, they pick up the pageantry, they pick up the exoticism, but they also pick up this literary problem of how do you make that work on a stage where the audience knows it's a set of characters that they expect to behave that way.
It's a completely different narrative structure, and in many ways it goes back to times when that kind of theater was very successful. If you think of Gluck, for example, if you think of Beethoven and his attempts at theater. But what had happened, you understand, is that Verismo had really run its course, so that people like Pirandello, people who were at the vanguard of modern opera in the 19-teens and 20s were saying Verismo, and if you know the basic aspects of Verismo, this is the insistence on having everything so real that, the guy, the tenor stabs Carmen on stage, and there's sex and violence, and it is real and it's gritty. And by the 20th century, especially after the First World War, when attitudes were changing so much, people were saying, verismo isn't realistic enough because it only shows actors pretending to be real. So Pirandello and people like this were saying, if you really want real theater, do it with puppets. Which is really quite interesting if you think about it, because it's more real because you accept the artifice that it's a theater. Whereas does everybody understand what I'm saying? And it's just the next thing. The next thing after realism was the opposite of realism. And so using puppets, using masks, using symbolism really became the thing to do. And I think Keith is so right about this issue of plot and how we see plot differently. We're so used in these, in Pagliacci and in those early Puccini arias for everything to be operas, for everything to be so real that we balk a little bit at this new approach to theater, but it was exactly what people were doing and what people were talking about at the time.
But the kind of character archetypes you see almost bring you back to Lohengrin or something as well, too. It seems like a reconnection.
I think you're absolutely right. And again, people get so tired of hearing me say this, but there's just no way to overstate Wagner's influence in every aspect of European culture. Yeah, either you're taking forward the ideas of Wagner or you're reacting to them in some way. But Wagner did bring back to opera that obsession with myth and archetype. So
he takes the story that's totally uncharacteristic for, it seems like, to everything he'd done up to that. The way his operas had progressed up to that point. Chinese princess tells riddles for a string of suitors who keep getting beheaded because they can't answer her riddles. Classic fairy tale. A successful story. As I understand it, the two greatest German writers of all time, Schiller and Goethe, got involved in an early production of Turandot. But he had to add his own character. He had to have that Puccini character, Liu. How did that come about?
I think that's really so wonderful because Puccini, as you say, people change, but at the same time, Puccini is Puccini. The basic plot line of this cold, cruel princess, and the fact that people hated the opera at the beginning because it didn't have that beautiful, sweet, suffering, feisty, but very feminine Puccini heroine, and that's what he created in Liu. It's interesting because there's a version by Busoni. The Turandot by Busoni has, instead of Liu, has another woman who's very much in love with Calaf, but he ends up rebuffing her for the sake of Turandot. But Puccini had to put this character in, this beautiful, sacrificial, good person, this slave girl who, out of love for Calaf, goes to her death rather than revealing his name. And she is so much in the mold of Mimi and La Bohème, of Madame Butterfly. And we love her so much, and we know from letters that Puccini loved her so much. And he said at the beginning of this process, he said, I can't tell you exactly what I'm planning, but there's going to be a real surprise. And it was adding that human element, that romantic element to this story, which doesn't seem that romantic. I would add to that, however, that I love Turandot so much, and I don't see this ice princess as suddenly changing. I mean, to me, the story is dramatically true, and it's a story of redemptive love. It's because of the sacrifice that Liu makes. That has something to do with the fact that Turandot, at the end, will give in to true love. And so I think the story works and hangs together beautifully. And I've always had trouble understanding why the Kermans of the world are so negative about it. It's not typical Puccini, but it has that element in you. And of course, it's interesting musically when you look at the opera, the Liu music, the music of her arias, and how that is a leitmotif throughout that has this strain of love, of sacrificial love, and how it is that music in the end that wins over the puppet music and the Chinese music, which has to do with not only with exoticism, but with violence and with uncertainty, because Turandot is somebody that we're all scared of.
I think some of the reason why it feels harder for some people to believe in that transformation is that it happened so quickly. And there are whole operas written about transformation of characters and what's driving that. And if there had been more doubt in Turandot earlier, so if she had been playing the Ice Queen, but she had a soliloquy that no one else saw of her wondering whether she was really, this was really what she was meant to be. I think dramatically, actually, as I said, it would be awful. But nonetheless, there would be a germ of that.
But if I can jump in, one of the things that is new that the librettist did at Puccini's request was that first aria. When we first meet Turandot, she is softened a little bit by telling the story of 2,000 years ago and her ancestress who had been treated badly by men and raped and killed. And so that's that little bit. It's not, and I'm so glad, like you say, that Puccini didn't go further. But we see the reason, and we see the reason for this bitterness. And I hear what you're saying, but it never strikes me as too quickly to me, because I'm so involved with this story of love, and by Calaf's confidence that true love will win. And then when I see what happens to Liu, I think that's got to have an effect on Turandot as well. So that, and then even at the end, she's resisting, and he tells her the name. This is what's so beautiful about it. He tells her his name, and she at one moment even intends to use it against him finally. But I think that the change, because it is the real dramatic linchpin of the story. So I don't know. I don't think of it as unrealistic, but I know exactly what you're saying, and you'll have to come see 2 or 3 performances. I think it comes down to the fact
that a happy ending is very hard to do in opera. And I see the description of Puccini could turn the emotional screws until it was just, you almost couldn't take it anymore with a character, like Tosca or like Liu. And that is the classic Puccini character, and she is in that situation that's so unbearable for you to witness. They haven't quite recovered by time for that transformation.
Well,
so
I think
that would be my Kerman-esque criticism.
I like it, but on the other hand, and this is something we don't talk about enough, is the opera we haven't talked about at all after Butterfly is La Fanciulla del West, the Girl of the Golden West. And that is a story that is so realistic and so heartbreaking and so full of emotional turmoil. But there too, there's a happy ending, because at the end, there's forgiveness and they ride off in the sunset together. And I think if Puccini hadn't done that, that wouldn't have pointed the way toward, and again, I don't want to, well, I do, because I love to talk about this opera. I think there's no way we can overstate the importance of the Trittico that he wrote during World War I, and particularly the only comedy he ever wrote, Gianni Schicchi. Because those 2 happy endings, The Girl of the Golden West and Gianni Schicchi, if you look at those 2 operas, they have an amazing effect on the structure of the opera and on the planning of the opera as well.
I don't know if we want to get too far into this, because I want to get you to the piano pretty soon. You got to show us how this opera works. But there is a story that there was a servant in the household who his wife got jealous of, and who may have inspired the Liu character in some way. Very tragic story.
I doubt that she inspired it, but I think there is some truth to this. As I said, Puccini deservedly had a reputation as a philanderer, and like Verdi before him, he had an affair with somebody else's mistress and fell in love and eventually married her. So his wife was very right to suspect him of philandering, because she had been a party to his philandering before they got married. But the fact is, he did sleep around an awful lot, and she knew it, and she had evidence of it. But in this terribly tragic case, she accused their maid of having an affair with her husband, with Puccini. And she denied it, but Mrs. Puccini was just merciless, and the poor girl ended up committing suicide. And it was discovered after her death by the medical examination that she had never had sexual relations before. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they might not have had some sort of an emotional affair. Puccini he flirted with anyone. But the fact is, people speculate that this tragic event had a terrible influence and a terrible impact on Puccini, and that maybe Liu was inspired by this servant girl. I don't personally subscribe to that, but it's interesting. It's fascinating.
Well, so I don't know where we want to start with music. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Keith, too, but
no, I think let's move to the music.
I think my big question that we have to answer tonight is how does Nessun Dorma operate? How does it work, and how does it have such universal appeal? What it is about that? And then I think the modernism of the piece is really interesting to talk about as well. But you may have your own ideas.
Yeah, let's start with that, with Nessun Dorma. It's do you mind if I just read the words of it? Because again, as Puccini goes along in this process of writing music, more and more, it's the words that inspire him to write the right music. And these words are just so beautiful. Nessun Dorma, of course, means let nobody sleep. And that is what we hear the guards saying as night is falling in Beijing, because Turandot has ordered that nobody be allowed to sleep until the name of this mysterious stranger is found. She wants the name so that she can kill him, because that's what she's able to do according to the game that's been set up. And so the prince Calaf hears these guards saying, Nessun Dorma, don't let anybody sleep. And he says, that's right, don't let anybody sleep, don't let anybody sleep. And then he sings to Turandot. He sings to this woman that he's in love with and that he knows through sheer love he will conquer. And he says, but you, O princess, in your cold bedroom, you are looking up at the stars that are trembling with love and with hope. But my mystery is enclosed, is kept secret in me. Nobody will know my name. No, I will say it on your mouth after the moon has shone and it's morning again. And my kiss will loosen the silence that makes you mine. And it's just so beautiful. So he says, so come on, night, hurry up and get over with. Disappear, night, set, stars, because at the dawn I will win. Vincerò, vincerò, I will win. It's an amazing, life-affirming, beautiful song of love and of confidence in the absolute power of love. And it's just so beautiful. And again, what Puccini does, the way he works as a composer, is that he finds a melody in the same way that Wagner would find a little leitmotif. He comes up with a melody sort of full-fledged in his mind, and then lets that melody grow and develop. And of course, the melody that we all love is this one. But if you look at the way the aria starts, it's just speaking. I hate to do this to you, but I might sing a little bit, and I'm so sorry. Nessun Dorma. You see, that's not a melody. Nessun Dorma. So what I think one of the things that we love so much about this aria is that it's just, there is no melody. It's just speaking. It's just a harmony. And then out of it, as he talks about what's going to happen, because time is standing still. The whole empire is in this waiting period. But he says, I'll tell you my name when I kiss you, and when I have won, then I'll tell you my name. And then the melody itself becomes this propulsive thing that takes on a life of its own and develops. And of course, that's the music that will come back at the end. And I guess we do need to talk about the fact that, as you all know, or if you don't, we should say, Puccini did not finish the opera. He died without having finished the opera. And again, we can talk about this till we're blue in the face. I'm frankly not that interested in the sense that I'm absolutely convinced that what we have is exactly what Puccini wanted. And of course, it grieves me and pains me that he wasn't able to write every last note of the ending. But at the same time, I think Alfano, he left lots of sketches, something like 36 pages of sketches, and written notes about what he wanted. And I think the ending works. I think it's beautiful. And I don't have to do like Toscanini did at the first performance. I don't have to say, okay, now after this point, this isn't by Puccini anymore. It really is by Puccini, and it's very conservative. You know, Toscanini put down his baton and said, we can't go any farther. The performance has to end because at this point the maestro died, is basically the way he said it. Now that's become apocryphal, and they say things like, he set down his pen at this moment or something like that. But the point is, I think the ending works very well. I don't mind the fact that other people have tried to come up with their own endings, people like Pierre Boulez, but I think the ending as it stands is the reason he took so long was not because he couldn't figure out what music to write. The reason that Puccini delayed on it was that he didn't have the right words, but he finally had the right words, and he accepted the words. So the words, in other words, he had the whole ending sketched out. So it's not like we're missing anything in this new ending. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? And again, I'm a little skeptical of people who talk about the great geniuses and the great composers and their last testaments and that sort of thing. Puccini did not know he was going to die. We have letters. Puccini had 5 more operas he wanted to write after this. Writing Turandot, even though in many ways he was drained and tired and getting sick, but writing Turandot also in many ways inspired him. And he had plenty of ideas for what was coming next. So I get a little impatient with the idea that, it's this, inspired word handed down divinely from angels. It's a piece of theater, and it's fantastic. So anyway, that's my opinion.
Hey, Megan, are we going on too long? Because I've still got more questions. Well, we've at least got to say, how do you pronounce it?
Yes, that's the big thing. You notice they both said Turandot, and then I said Turandot once, and then I tried to catch myself and say Turandot. It does seem, this is pretty much verifiable. It does seem that people in the first production said Turandot. And so that this would be in some ways like a French word like Margot. It's not completely clear because, and Rosa Raiza, who was the first Turandot, insisted on that. On the other hand, we have a little poem that Puccini wrote to Ricordi in which he actually rhymed the word Turandotte with notte, for example, okay? The fact is that if you're speaking Italian, you say Turandot, and that's why I can't help it, I just say that. But the fact is, it seems that Puccini and his circle, as they were writing this opera, called it Turandot. So I guess in a way they own the title. They have the copyright.
Well, and at the Dallas Opera, we had a long discussion on this topic, and we decided for sake of consistency, we all agreed to say Turandot. But I think part of why this is hard is there are good arguments to be made for both pronunciations, or even others like Turandot and so forth. Or if you want to do the Persian Turandot, I gather is yet another possibility. But we just made a decision that we would not pronounce the final T, and so far we've stuck to it. And thank you for being such a good guest at emulating your hosts.
Yes, that's nice.
No, absolutely. I say Turandot, but I'm convinced that it's wrong. You know what I mean? In other words, I have no problem believing that it should be Turandot. It's just going to take me another 10 years to learn to say it that way.
If I can do just a very quick sidebar, there are lots of examples on operatic repertoire on what gets translated and what doesn't. So one of the things that typically general directors and the marketing team and the artistic team do before the start of every season is talk about all of the different choices. Whether, for example, we're going to call it the magic flute or Zauberflöte. All sorts of, we're going to say Marriage of Figaro is very often used rather than the Italian. So there are these kinds of choices. And I remember actually sitting at San Francisco Opera in a room with David Gockley when I was there, and we were talking about Mozart's Don Giovanni, and he very wittily pointed out that really we should be putting it in the brochure as Sir John. So you can, as I say, play this too far. But specifically for Turandot, we decided we'd leave the T out.
Well, I do want to talk a little bit about the production because I think it's been very popular with audiences. Like Aida, the production before it kind of calls for larger than life staging. What have you got coming?
It does. We believe the iconic production. It has been rented and performed all over the country. And in fact, we were pulling it out of the trailers next week to look at what shape it's in. It was stored down in Fair Park, and Fair Park was hit very hard by the hail. We actually had roof damage and air conditioning damage, and we're hoping that none of the hail penetrated the trailers. But because the production has been done so many times, we also know that we have to do a certain amount of renovation. For those of you who've seen the production before, there's a huge dragon. There's also a giant pearl on the stage, and we do know that the giant pearl needs some renovation, so that's on the checklist. But it's one of the little vagaries of running an opera company that till we pull it out of the storage trailers, and it's a big deal to pull an opera set out of storage trailers. It's nothing you just sort of open a closet and take a peek. We actually don't know what it's going to cost to repair it, so we're all hoping that it's in great shape.
Fantastic. Is it easy to mount a production that you've already got the stuff for? Does it take a little bit of the...
The biggest logistical challenge we'll have is really not so much mounting Turandot on its own, but the fact that we'll be performing it in rep with a brand new production of the Aspirin Papers. And one of the great features of this hall is we have such a huge backstage space that we could really perform 3 operas all at the same time if we had a season that big. In this case, we're performing 2, but we need to move. Between each performance, we have to take one set off and put the other one back on. And depending on how the sets are constructed, that can actually take a lot of time and effort. So that, I think, is going to be, rather than just the mounting Turandot per se, it's making it work and rep with a brand new production of Aspirin Papers.
All right. I also think it's noting that Alexander Rome's got a lot to do probably in this. The chorus has a huge, much larger role than any other Puccini opera, right?
Yes, much larger, although the chorus in Fanciulla del West is pretty massive too. But what's different about it from other Puccini choruses, if you think of La Bohème, where Act 2 is this big chorus scene and everybody's singing 3 or 4 different texts at one time, and it's all about the motion, the sellers who are selling things, the people who are partying. Turandot, even though it feels so massive, from a production standpoint and from a staging standpoint, isn't as difficult because in many ways the chorus is more like a Greek chorus, except they're Chinese. And so very often their music is infused with that sense of myth and ritual and pageant. And so it's not so much about looking real as about adding this element. It is the chorus that shows us at the beginning how scared we should be at Turandot, because they start screaming in this bloodthirsty way, kill him, chop his head off, and all these things. It is the chorus who is transformed by Liu's sacrifice and by her death. It is the chorus that then starts rooting for Calaf. And so in many ways, they kind of just stand there, and it's okay. And again, that's the last thing you would ever think of with Puccini, but it really does work.
And they're a mob that's swayed from moment to moment in a way.
That's exactly right. And so very often it's the stage direction involves very subtle choreography, which isn't really active, but it's very minimal, but you can do amazing things with it. And again, building on some of the elements of Chinese theater, which Puccini was conscious of, and then, as I say, the masks. You realize that three of the main characters are these commedia dell'arte figures, Ping, Pang, and Pong, because they're Chinese commedia dell'arte figures, who are commenting on the action. And again, give it this remove and a bit of irony and humor as well. So there are aspects of it that are very much like spectacle, but the death of Liu herself is actually incredibly dramatic and real visually. So again, Puccini is playing with different styles here.
Well, I think we'd better take a few minutes for questions. I know there's probably a comment or a question or two out in the audience. Do we have an extra mic for that? Or we've got one right here on the stand. Anybody have anything they'd like to add?
I would be interested in knowing the exact historic time frame that he lived and wrote, and how that history might have affected what he did, and how he
absolutely. And we fail very often by not stating the most important facts. Puccini lived in the second half of the 19th century. He was born in the 1860s. He died in 1924, and this is his very last opera, which was not performed until 1926. And so this is what I was saying about the First World War. 1893, I guess, is Manon Lescaut. 1894-5 is La Bohème. The way the world changed between then and the 1920s, 1920, when he first started work on Turandot, you're exactly right. Putting him in context at a time when he was seen by some as a hopeless throwback to Romanticism. It was, you say you went to school and at Berkeley. I can tell you my schooling, and yours might have been the same way. We were taught to look down on, my schooling was very, very Germanic. And we were taught to look down on anybody who didn't follow that magic route from Beethoven and Schubert to Wagner to Mahler and Strauss, but then to Schoenberg. And we also, without dating these younger gentlemen, but I can say with authority as an older man, we literally were taught to despise music that was written in the 20th century but sounded pretty. And that is a fact. It's no longer the case. So there's a lot of baggage historically from what was happening then, and there's baggage in the way it's been treated since then as well.
But also in what was going on in the world kind of file, was the Toscanini performance, the first performance, the one in which he made a kind of his own statement about the regime? I understand that he refused at one point to play the anthem.
Yes, I mean, this is the other thing that's happening, because Puccini, of course, is being seen as the great cultural figure who put Italy back on the map, and that is combining with some very extreme nationalism. And the fact is, Mussolini is gaining power at the very same time. And the premiere of Turandot in April, I think it was, of 1926, was such a huge deal. And by that time, Mussolini is in power, and it is being seen as the premiere that will put Italy back on the map. And Mussolini, very graciously, I don't want to say anything nice about Mussolini, but the fact is, Mussolini intended to come to the premiere because it was the event that everybody wanted to be at. And Toscanini despised Mussolini so much, but he was still untouchable because he was such a famous personage. Toscanini said, "I will not conduct if Mussolini comes." And so Mussolini graciously, I'm sure he had ulterior motives and wished he could have, put the guy in front of a firing squad. But he did not attend the premiere acceding to the wishes of Toscanini.
There's just one other last historical event I would point out, which is Debussy, who died in 1918, of course, very close to this time period, and Puccini is clearly starting to pick up some of that chromaticism, use of augmented chords and so forth, as well as some of the orchestration techniques. So in addition to all of that political events, there's also then, I think, a very powerful influence of Debussy.
I think
as well.
I think you're absolutely right, and we see it earlier. We see it with Butterfly as well. But there are so many sounds, and this is what Puccini is such a genius at writing a harmonic palette. Notice I'm playing all on the black notes right now. That what we call pentatonic music, which is very often associated, that pentatonic scale, with Oriental cultures and with Asian music. So he puts that in there, and then he manages to exploit, to mine the riches of that basic scale to find bitonal harmonies that fit together in ways that you wouldn't normally think about it, and really exploring a whole new landscape of sound that I think Keith is absolutely right. He gets from Puccini, and then I think there's also Stravinsky as well.
Well, there's a ton of motor rhythms. I mean, really, really strong pulsing rhythms. You could almost put a techno beat to them, and it sounded pretty good.
It's really a great percussion part. There's a lot of fascinating stuff with gongs, and there are tons of little Chinese and Japanese instruments, and it's a marvel of orchestration. The orchestration is unbelievable.
Anybody else?
I'll do you first. Thank you. I was just curious, what was the first American opera company to perform this, and what year?
It was that year in November. In New York. I guess they called it the Metropolitan Opera at the time, or at least the precursor of what we have. But it came from Milan, from La Scala. It went to Venice, then immediately went to Buenos Aires. That's the part of the world I'm from, and I'm very proud of that. But that was April, May, and June. But by November, they were performing it in New York, as they would have insisted on, because Puccini was such an icon.
Thank you, guys. I was wondering, Nessun Dorma is so famous. Is there an aria in this opera that you think is in the shadows, unfortunately, because Nessun Dorma is so famous?
I'd be glad to take that, but if you want to.
No, I know Liu's aria was the very last one he ever wrote. I have to. I would have to say it doesn't have the hook, necessarily. But.
Well, there's something special about Nessun Dorma, there's no question. But yes, the arias in this opera are stunning. I'm a big fan of that first aria of Turandot, where she details what happened to her female ancestor. But yes, the two arias of Liu, the first one in which she is pleading with Kalaf not to risk his life. And then the second one, right before she dies, where she talks directly to the princess, to Turandot, and says, "You are girded with ice, but you will be conquered by the fire of love. And I know that I'm dying, but I know that I'm dying in order for him to win you." It's so beautiful. And then the music that flows out of that aria as he uses that theme, and she gets killed, she's tortured and killed, and then there's this beautiful procession as everybody mourns her death. It is a stunning, stunning moment. But there's no question that in terms of spectacle and high drama and triumph, that Nessun Dorma is in a place all by its own.
One more. But we better wrap it up after that.
Okay. The composer who actually finished it, did he go back and revise anything? Or are we hearing pure Puccini in the first part?
I'd be glad to. No, he didn't revise a thing. And it's very interesting. Puccini, even though he didn't understand that he was dying, did write Giulio Ricordi, the publisher, and say, "Please don't let my Turandot die." Okay, so he knew it wasn't finished yet. And he had specified that he wanted, I can you remember? It was a well-known composer. He specified he wanted him to do it, and the guy wasn't available. And then they suggested many other people, but the publisher didn't like some people. Puccini's son didn't like somebody else who was selected. So Franco Alfano, who was a student of and a disciple of Puccini, and who had worked with him closely and knew his music backward and forward, was given the sketches and obviously given an impossible job. We do know that Alfano did not set some of the text that Puccini had intended to set because the sketches weren't there of the music, but he didn't change a thing of the earlier part.
But also Luciano Berio, I think, gave it a whack, but I guess people aren't as crazy about it.
Yes, Berio did his own ending as well, and many people have thought to try to improve on the Franco Alfano because they see it as too bare or happening too quickly. But I mean, it's over. At that point, it's over. So.
All right, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
This is fun.